All right, we're live.
All right.
Hey, Peter.
How you doing?
Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine, and thank you, and my apologies to everyone for my lack of technical abilities.
No, it's great to have you on, and thank you for bearing with us through that 10-minute delay. But before we start, so we have Peter Weygandt. Will introduce himself shortly, but for this, we each chose 2 wines from the Weygandt Selections portfolio that we were really excited about, that I think Matt, myself, and Peter all feel like maybe the world doesn't know about yet. So we're just going to have a natural conversation about these producers. I know Peter really wants to talk about the people behind them, and Matt and I will kind of go in depth on the wines. But first, Peter, do you want to tell everyone out there who might not be familiar with you and your portfolio about your business and yourself and how long you've been doing everything?
Oh, yes, thanks. Yeah, the selections that you made are very good, very interesting, and they're pretty typical, representative of the things that we do that I've always enjoyed. I started, well, as an importer. It began as a hobby back in 1987. Formed wonderful working relationships with a lot of people over the years. Was led to it probably the way a lot of you people have been, through my love of wine and fascination with geography and geology and tradition, and then mostly the people who I met, who share the same feeling about what really makes wine that we find to be special is their respect for the place and their respect for the traditions of making wine in a pure and balanced fashion. The people that I've worked with, haven't followed fads. They're real artisans, and I'm hoping that in their tasting today you'll see that. I have a great group of people who work with me. Wonderful people here in the office that got me into this tasting finally. If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be here. And then a great staff both in New York and California. And we work with distributors around the country in about 30 plus states for our selections.
Yeah, and so before we go into the wines, I wanted to mention that after talking with Peter and our representative out in California, anyone who's watching who wants to buy these wines, you can reach out to Flatiron Wines in San Francisco, and we've arranged to make it so that anyone who wants any of these 6 selections, you can get your hands on them.
Which, thank you for that. I know it's not been easy to get certain things out of warehouses and delivered. So yeah, thank you for making those available.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really love about your portfolio is that, like some other really prominent importers, when you see Peter Weygandt wines on the back of a label that you imported it and selected it, I've really come to trust your palate with producers that I might not know about. When I see that you put your stamp on them, I intrinsically am willing to give them a chance more than I would otherwise. I think that your portfolio is super, super well balanced, and I think that you've brought some really interesting things to the United States. And I know, so Peter picked the first wine, which was new to both Matt and I. So would you like to start by talking about the Cheverny Blanc?
Yes. So the producer here is Luc Perchet. The name of the domain is Epicourchois. That's basically a takeoff on the name of the region. Around Cheverny, Courchois is sort of the colloquial name, and the soil here is gravelly, sandy gravel over limestone. The typical name, or the local name for it, is Salonia. And Luke has come to this fairly recently. I started with him about 6 or 7 years ago. Um, and he acquired the vineyard and immediately converted to biodynamic viticulture. And the wine that we're having this morning is the Cheverny Blanc. And Luke, like so many of the producers I work with, does things quite traditionally. Um, and and what I really like about the Cheverny, most of them now are a blend of Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay, but his is 40% Menu Pinot and then 60% Sauvignon. The age of the vines is quite old as well. The Menu Pinot is 65-year-old vines, and the Sauvignon, there's one parcel that's 30, another parcel that's 50 years old, and a third that's 100 approximately years old. Everything is done in tank, and it's remarkable how he is able to work with no sulfites or virtually no sulfites. For instance, the wine that you're tasting now is about 6 grams per liter free sulfites. So virtually
So
no.
Peter, did he pick Menu Pinot because it was planted, or did he pick the site because it had Menu Pinot planted and he really loved that variety?
I think he was enamored, felt very fortunate to find this domain with the traditional varieties and a lot of old vines. He also produces a Cour Cheverny. Officially, the vines are reported to be 110 years old, but he said they're
Wow.
probably in excess of 120. They probably were planted before the turn of the 20th century, and that's really exciting. You know, I love old vines. You know, you can't replace 100 years.
Yeah. And this wine, I mean, even though it is comprised mostly Sauvignon Blanc, it doesn't really share. I mean, it's very distinct from other Loire Valley Sauvignon Blancs that are 100% Sauvignon Blanc. It doesn't, when you taste it, it doesn't remind you of Sancerre. It's kind of its own style. It's really interesting. And you know, for me, I've only had this grape Menu Pinot a handful of times. It's also grown, from my understanding, to a very limited extent in Vouvray, where it's called Hors Bois, and supposedly it's allowed in the wines, but no one ever actually blends it in, or none of the producers that I drink typically for Vouvray have any Hors Bois in the blend. So it's pretty cool to find a wine that has such a large proportion in it, because I think, at least in California, it's not a grape that we get to taste a lot. But
Well,
super interesting. So,
yeah, I mean, that's what I'm always looking for, is things that are traditionally, is the traditional blend, the traditional varieties, and this was a perfect fit for me.
So Peter, at the risk of, I don't want to get off track on it, but I know you have a lot of biodynamic producers in your book. Can you speak just briefly to the process? You know, obviously Luc Percher took over this vineyard, and you said converted to biodynamic. What's the process of doing that with something that has vines this old? I mean, what is it? What did he have to do? How, it seems like he actually did it pretty quickly, you know, whereas some take a much longer time to get it off.
From speaking with growers, it's the first year where the vine is like most surprised and stressed. It's become, you know, somewhat, don't want to use the word dependent, but accustomed to certain kinds of treatments, and then you're switching that all of a sudden. But in the matter of a couple, 3 years, the change is dramatic. That, you know, you're changing the dynamic of what is below the surface. The root structure is completely changed. You're getting a healthier plant that's looking for its strength and nutrition and resistance from its environment, rather than from what is the treatments that are being placed on it. So it's in the hands of the right producer, and people who know me know that I sometimes get a little carried away when on these things of biodynamic and no sulfites. It all depends on the producer and the skill, the knowledge, and the work that they put into it. These can just be either catchphrases, or they can be really a significant change in the texture and the complexity of the wine.
And so someone asked in the question, and any who ask questions, feel free to post them there. We'll try to knock them out as they come in. Someone asked, what are the characteristics of the grape? I've only maybe had 2 or 3 examples of it, so I don't know if I could across the board say that Menu Pinot always tastes this way or in another way. But to me, it's a little bit lower in acidity than other white Loire varieties, and it just has a little bit more of like a honeysuckle quality, and also maybe like an herbal note that isn't like Sauvignon Blanc's herbal quality. It almost reminds me of like mustard greens. It's a little weedier, not in a bad way. I'm struggling with the exact
well, honestly,
word.
I think more than anything, it in this glass at least, it proved to be a really brilliant counterpoint to the Sauvignon. You know, it fills in a little bit of texture to kind of, you know, give a nice counterpoint to that bright acidity and even the aromatics of the Sauvignon. They play together really beautifully, and it kind of fleshes it out a little bit.
Yeah. But anyone who
that's a very good description. That's how I see it as well, and I think it explains much the tradition of this varietal in the region. It's a perfect complement.
Right on. Well, we'll keep moving on because we're going to get to the next wine. But yeah, any notes on any of those sort of biodynamics as far as establishing the vineyards and what they had to go through, why they did it? Those are definitely notes I'd be interested in hearing more about as we talk to the producers.
So I selected the next wine. The producer is Valentin Zuslin, and this is one of the Riesling bottlings. There's a couple of different vineyards that the domain makes. Bolenberg, which is a Ludi, Finksburg, which is a Grand Cru, and Clos Liebenberg, which is another Ludi that happens to be a monopole of the domain. And Alsace, for me, it was a region that took me a really long time to come around with, because for a really long time, when I was kind of moving up in the wine world, a lot of the wines that I tasted just had a varying level of sweetness. It was really hard to understand the region for me, and I'd been looking for producers in Alsace that were making biodynamic wines and wines as naturally as possible. So I was really excited when I discovered Valentin Zuslin through my Weygandt representative, because I think that they embody all of those qualities while also embracing the traditions of Alsace. And this vineyard, Clos Liebenberg, it's just to the north of Finksburg, which is a terroir. There's a lot of producers that make wine in this area of Alsace. Just to the south, you have Spiegel and Sering Grand Cru, where you have some other really great producers like Dulle, Cadet. But I've just always found that Zuslin's wines are incredibly underrated, even now that they're distributed in the United States. We have a really great vertical of the Finksburg at Michael Mina. I just think that they're some of the best Rieslings in Alsace.
Well, exactly. It's a great choice that you've made, because the Clos Liebenberg is near and dear to the Zuslin family. It's a brother-sister, Jean-Paul and his sister Marie, taking over from their father. They began the conversion to biodynamic in 1997, and as you were saying, Jeremy, it was everything is done very, very naturally. They harvest, I think, incredible pHs, very low pHs, and this enables them to, and of course, indigenous yeasts. And then they do a long, very long fermentation and an élevage in large foudre. The wines often go through malolactic and are often bottled without any filtration and with low levels of sulfites. What makes them I think they're unique in all of the wines I've had a lot of experience tasting Alsace wines. I love Alsace wines, but there are really none quite like the wines of Süßland. They age extraordinarily well. They have a texture and a natural quality to them that is unique and I would say unsurpassed.
Yeah, and their Pinot Noir, which we're not tasting today, to me, the Ofri's Pinot Noir is one of my favorite red wines of Alsace. Actually, one of your other producers, I think between two of your Alsace producers, you have some of the best red wines in Alsace of any importer, because the Albert Mann Pinot Noirs that they're doing in Hengst, for example, they're making Grand Cru Pinot Noir that they can't call Grand Cru at the moment. But those are, really, I think, changing the way that people are perceiving, the potential for red wines in that region.
Well, the Albert Mann Grand Cru vineyards are all biodynamic also. And the Clos Liebenberg is a perfect site for biodynamic because it's on the edge of the vineyard area. On the other side is woods. And there's this beautiful interaction between the vineyards and their surroundings. It's at 360 meters altitude, faces east, and the soil is sandstone and marl, and a perfect situation for Riesling.
Peter, you mentioned that one of the notes about this producer is they get extremely low pHs, which for those of you watching along, if you're not familiar, is going to mean a higher acid wine. What is it about their site and their way of growing their vines that does that, do you think?
Well, I mean, they attribute it
I know so feel free
entirely to the biodynamic viticulture. But I also, again, I think Jean-Paul is a fantastic vigneron, and all the work that results in these perfect numbers like low pHs and balance, that comes from 364 days of work in the vineyard before you harvest.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
So yeah, beautiful wine. Great choice, Jeremy. We'll move on to the next so we can leave a little time at the end for Q&As.
Yeah.
And I believe this is your pick, Peter.
We have Domaine
Yes,
Râpé.
Yes. Well, this is Vincent Râpé. Follows in a long line of vignerons in Pernod. There's a Tate de Vin in their cellar with the engraved name Râpé in it, dated 1765. They have some great vineyard sites, some of the best, in my opinion, situated of Corton Charlemagne, because it's on the west side facing west-northwest, making it the coolest area of Corton Charlemagne, the side near Pernon-Vergelès. And then this vineyard, this is all from a single vineyard called Combat, which is sort of on the opposite side of the village of Pernon, around a little further around the hill of Corton. High altitude. The vines are about between 25 and 30 years old. Everything, of course, is entirely hand harvested. Indigenous yeast fermentations. And the vinification is in 350 liter barrels, not the typical 228 barrique, and only 10% new oak. So you're really getting the expression of the terroir of a cool climate, north area of the Côte de Beaune. And Vincent is starting to get a lot of attention from, wine writers, and well merited. For me, it's just a great example of a very, very nice Burgundy at a very good price.
Yeah, it's sort of hidden in plain sight too. This is always, I think, all of their selections way over deliver for what you get. And sometimes people don't look at Pernon simply because it's not one of the bigger names, and it's a damn shame because they're really just laser focused, beautiful versions of Chardonnay. Which the analogy that kept coming up as I was thinking about it was everyone knows that the great shows are on Broadway and all that stuff, but the real geeks and the locals go to the off, kind of like the off Broadway shows.
Yeah.
Find some of these really beautiful examples that maybe don't have the grabby name, and this is where you find
it's a good analogy.
And great for them.
And I don't know if it wasn't the case, but in my memory, and 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I don't remember there being a lot of Pernod Vergeless whites in the market. And in the past couple of years, I've been seeing more and more of it, but from top producers as well. For instance, we were pouring this exact vineyard from Pierre-Yves Collin-Murray. We were pouring by the glass at Michael Mina. And Ramenet is also making a white from La Belle File, which is not too far.
Right.
But that it's a terroir that people, if you haven't had Pernod Vergeless Blanc, it's almost like a baby Corton Charlemagne, and it's so affordable. This wine from Rapé it reminds me a lot of some of my favorite whites in Burgundy because it's very bright. It's really light on its feet. It has that kind of matchstick quality that I really enjoy from, I mentioned Pierre-Yves Collin-Murray. That's a flavor profile that I tend to get in wines that are made in a really reductive nature. And this has all of those same qualities. But at the same time, I don't know how many people really, I don't know if the secret's out about Rapé yet. But the whites, this really tremendous. I think it can hold its own against any of those maybe slightly more famous names.
Well, if you want to let the secret out, it's okay with me.
I think the first time I was introduced, I thought that there was a typo, and I thought I was tasting Rapé. And he's like, no, these are Rapé, they're great. And the joke was how much that extra H actually costs in bottle. But,
well, I think part of the explanation is with climatic change. These vineyards that were considered secondary years ago because they were higher altitude and facing west and northwest, they were cooler. Now that's an ideal situation. And there's a lot of, great young winemakers, and Vincent Rapé is certainly one of them.
Yeah, I think that's definitely been an interesting thing to see is the grapes that were kind of not used as much because they had issues with either late ripening or anything have really kind of pushed to the forefront now with temperatures going up all around the world. And that's certainly I think a case can be made for hopefully Roussanne getting a little bit more love in coming years, which we'll get into in a minute as we go into the next wine. So the next wine we have is this has long been one of my favorite sleeper bottles, and it shouldn't be a sleeper, but still is somehow. Raymond Ucelio, Pure Roussanne, Châteauneuf de Pop Blanc 2016. So I remember when I first got into this wine, actually, when Jeremy, you said something about, looking at the producer on the back of a bottle when you go into a shop. I think the first time I was told that, like 15 or 16 years ago, the example that was given to me was, were your wines, Peter, was to look for Weygandt on the back, and then, a few more added in later. But that was sort of the first standard of find a good importer and that matches your taste. And I remember as I was looking for classic examples to try to differentiate Marsanne and Roussanne, which so often get lumped together, it's like, well, how are they different? Like people just throw in the towel and it's like, yeah, they're pretty much the same thing. And yeah, they've got some characteristics, but I really wanted to taste the difference, and that's how I stumbled on this wine. And it's long been a favorite. So I guess first, before we even get into the wine, just to go down a little difference between Marsanne and Roussanne. One, Marsanne would be planted here because it's not one of the allowed grapes for Châteauneuf de Pop, but it is far more favored up in the northern Rhone than I believe Roussanne is. I think even Chapoutier refuses to work with Roussanne, and it gets a bad rap a lot of times, even though I think it really makes more elegant wines. And I think it gets that bad rap because it's more susceptible to like fungal diseases, botrytis, powdery mildew, mites, thrips, all that stuff, and it's harder to grow and frankly less productive than its counterpart Marsanne. So it was just maybe people weren't willing to put in the extra effort for it. But with it also being a late ripener, maybe that's something that now the temperatures are going up might be less of a problem. And and as you can taste in this wine, you know, it's fine. I think you even said it before we got into talking about it. It's a very aromatic wine, more aromatic than most Roussanne.
Most Marsan.
Sorry, most Marsan. Now I'm getting it mixed up. Geez. You know, what that says to me, Marsan Roussanne blends usually have a very strong nutty element to them, and not even just from being aged in large barrel, but just it was sort of its one of those indicators of the variety itself. And this one, Roussanne, I'm finding, has it's more aromatic. It's more kind of like herbal teas,
Yes.
more citrus, a little more like blossomy flowers, things like that. And it, more importantly, it's got higher acidity, which I think is what helps it age very well. And if you ever get a chance to try some older Roussanne, do yourself a favor. It's really, really beautiful. Where obviously I got into this wine as an educational tool, but I found it super useful when you're working whether it's just on your wine list or even with wine pairings. It's got this texture and weight naturally, even before you add any oak or anything like that, that is pretty unique in wine. So I think if you have big Chardonnay drinkers, especially Cali Chardonnay drinkers, and they're looking for something new, this is a great way to go because it at least matches that base mouthfeel.
Well, I think there's no doubt that Roussanne in Châteauneuf-du-Pape is the greatest white grape that's available there, and whether it's this or also a really popular example would be Beaucastel's Old Vine of exclusively Roussanne. It's the wine that can certainly age the longest for the white varieties, and you can spot in the glass how different they are when young, because Roussanne is darker in hue. It has almost this like reddish tint to it. And flavors are a little bit more bruised when young. It has like bruised red apple, yellow pear, and very floral, lots of like sunflower, marigold, but it doesn't have as much of those nutty aromas that I usually associate with Marsanne. And Hermitage Blanc, you get that like almond skin, and also this almost painful bitterness with young Marsanne, because it's so tannic. And not to say that Roussanne also has tannin, but certainly not as, for me, as angular as 100% Marsanne wines that when they're young, they could just be very, very aggressive in their tannin.
The one thing I'll add too is we talked about the difference in the grapes. Just some notes on the wine that I think make it stand out is where this is. So the vineyards he gets this Roussanne from there's a couple sites, but there's some in La Croix, which is arguably one of the great Ludites of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and then the other two are adjoining it, Terre Blanche and Bois-Sénéchaux. So you have that. It's also right across, I think right across the road, Peter, correct me if I'm wrong, but right across the road from the namesake home that gave the name to Châteauneuf-du-Pape, the ruins of the old home of the Pope. So it's got some, it's close to the center of where history started.
Yeah, it's this cuvee actually began sort of fortuitously. I've worked with the Useglio family for many, many years, over 25 years, and it was one year, I can't remember exactly, it was some around 15, 20 years ago. Stefan and I were tasting the white Châteauneuf-du-Pape, and he was going to blend in a barrel of the Roussanne into his final blend, but he was keeping it in barrel. And I said, well, what would you think of just keeping that barrel aside? Actually, it was 2 barrels. Keeping those 2 barrels aside for me, and I'll take that Roussanne pure, done in barrique. And that was the beginning of this cuvee. The vines were planted in 1985. They're mostly on that little area where Bois-Sénéchaux and La Croix come together. But the interesting thing is it's a parcel of exact north exposition. Stefan, also biodynamic in his viticulture, works well to get the pH very low. He has, like this one with the 2016 was harvested at 3.3. So, you're talking about almost Burgundy levels of pH, almost unheard of in the Southern Rhone. All vinified in barrique, mostly new. And it's a wine, as you said, for for long aging. It's fantastic structure.
Can I ask, and the harvest of this wine, I know in some areas of the Northern Rhone, like Condrieu, sometimes there can be botrytis grapes. Is there ever any botrytis on the Roussanne that Ucelio makes?
No, he harvests this pretty early, and
Okay.
with the alcohol not getting over the top. It's around 14.
I was trying to determine if those super ripe flavors in the wine were maybe a component of botrytis, or if they're just the way Roussanne tastes.
Oh,
yeah.
My hunch is that it's Roussanne grown by a great winemaker, biodynamic. I think that's really a lot to do with those aromas and flavors you're getting.
Yeah, and I think for all those watching, if you can find a 100% Marsanne as well and try these side by side. But the thing I realized doing that was how much blending those actually kind of cancel each other out a little bit, which is fine for that style. But I think it's also really fascinating to see how these show on their own, just really beautiful. And if for all you sommeliers, try giving this to people who like their sort of big, heavy white wines. And it does really well. And I'm not saying it's like overly heavy or anything, but it can stand up to those while offering something still nuanced. So it's not just hitting you in the face.
And
great with lobster.
It's just
there you go.
White Rhone is just a category of wine that throughout my career I've been waiting to see them go up in price alongside all my other favorite wines of the world. And I've seen Barolo, and I've seen Northern Rhone Syrah, and definitely Burgundy skyrocket in price. But it's one of the very few classic wine regions of the world, at least for its whites, that you could still buy for a really, really affordable price. You could buy one of the best versions of for like under $50 retail.
Yeah. Well, we'll move on to our next. As you noticed, of our 6 wines, we actually have 5 wines, which I think honestly we just got excited about picking the wines and didn't pay attention to the mix as well. But they're all great wines and I love them, and we're getting into the warmer months, so it fits well. Now, if you remember the first wine we had, the Luc Perchet, had a decent amount of Sauvignon, so it would have made sense that our next wine, which is the Timant Sauvignon Blanc from Styria or Südsteiermark, Austria, it would make sense to put those next to each other, and that was our original plan. And Peter advised that we put it after because it's so big. And man, great call. I obviously know the wines well, so I'm not surprised. But I'm so glad you did that because these are gigantic wines. They have a ton of personality. They really span, I think, what I love about Old World Sauvignon Blanc and New World Sauvignon Blanc extremely well. And actually, I think, I obviously had plenty of Sauvignon Blancs, but having had early exposure in my career to a lot of Austrian wines, these are the ones I really, really fell in love with I think that Styrian Sauvignon Blanc has the chance to make some of the greatest Sauvignon Blancs that the world knows. And obviously, we all know, we can talk about Austria's history and how they got hit. They took a pretty major blow early on and had to bounce back from that. I feel like Styria didn't for a while, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, Peter, but my take on it is that it has to do a lot with, Styria was a pretty poor part of the country for a while. It wasn't right on the river, so there wasn't a lot of like river market access. It was away from the major cities, so you didn't have a lot of that going on. Tourism wasn't hitting it as much. You didn't have the deep pockets elsewhere, so it kind of fell off. And I think as tourism got going again, frankly, I think Austria is great with tourism, and even their wine marketing board is just about any country I've seen. The Austrian Wine Marketing Board's website is the greatest source for information on a country's wine I've ever seen. So check it out if you haven't. But yeah, I think they've really bounced back. And a lot of the reason for that is the STK, the Steirische Terroir Classics Weinguter. It's an association of, I believe, is it 12 winemakers or somewhere around there, 11, 12, something like that, who really wanted to restore the glory to Sauvignon Blanc from Styria. Obviously there's Timant, there's Gross, Hannah Sabathi, Poles, a lot of really great producers doing really very purposeful things. And that association has a lot of stipulations too, much like I would say Vinea Vacau. You know, they're very clear about what they want to do. They have things that aren't just technical tweaks, but actually they frame some of their rules in terms of what the final product is gonna taste like. So they're not just about must weights and harvest levels. They're about, you know, how things should show up, you know, not, you know, using their classifications are based on flavor and not on ripeness. So you have the Junker wines, the young wines, which often don't leave the country. You have things like this, like the classic style, which are meant to be just your classic version of it, you know, almost like calibrating your palate. And then you get into the Erstlager and Grosslager, which, you know, Timon has some great ones in like Grossenberg and all that. So, do we put this label yet?
Just a little bit of history. The Styria, or in German it's Steiermark, in the early 1800s was the largest wine producing region in the Habsburg Empire. Well over 2,000 hectare just in that area. So there's a long history, and in fact, the Sauvignon Blanc was growing back in that time. It was called the Muscat Sylvaner by the Germans, by the Austrians, but it was Sauvignon Blanc. And
thank God it's already confusing enough.
I would say, you know, I have the honor and pleasure to be working with some of the greatest winemakers in the world, but certainly at the very top, in the top group of those, I would put Armin Temment, Manfred Temment's son. This young man is absolutely brilliant and one of the hardest working people I've ever met, and just has that knack of a great winemaker. He's absolutely committed to making the best possible Sauvignon Blanc he can. He asked me if I could arrange a visit to see Edmond Vaton with him and to get Vaton wines. And he has a terroir there that is remarkable. It's mostly fossilized limestone, very steep vineyards, fossilized limestone and marn. There are some outcroppings of slate, of schist, but this is his classic, which is called Kalk und Kreide, which means fossilized limestone and marn, is taken from over 30 different parcels, all biodynamically grown. It's certified organic, but done biodynamic, all hand harvested, indigenous yeasts. For us, he does a cuvee that's about 30% fermented and aged in large foudre, 70% in tank, and then it's bottled unfiltered.
Yeah, and you know what I like about this too is I find I like Sauvignon Blancs that speak to the origins of the name Blanc. They have that sauvage kind of flavor. They're a little bit I don't know. They're just a little bit kind of like raw. You know, I don't like them when they get too polished. And these have some of the polish that I think some New Worlds have, and the intensity, but not. They're still well balanced out. I mean, they definitely hit you a lot with the aromatics, but the way the acidity hits on the palate is just absolutely stunning. And to give a counterpoint, you know, we've talked a lot. I mean, those who like these styles of wine have probably also talked a lot about Italian wines and Slovenian wines and what crosses at the border over there. Well, so this is the other border, right? And if I'm not mistaken, Temment is actually kind of blurs that line a little bit as well. So yeah, they've got a little bit of that. Please.
Their vineyards are right on the border of Slovenia. In fact, part of Cireg is in Slovenia. And this characteristic, the intense aromatics and concentration have a lot to do with the climate there. Very warm days and very, very cool nights. The high elevation, so you have large contrast between day and night temperatures. Ideal.
I think that's fascinating. It speaks to how old some of these regions are. When regions sort of they don't adhere to even geographical boundaries, like, you know, the region of Styria crossing over into Slovenia too. It just shows you how back it went, which is pretty amazing to think.
Yeah. And I think one of the reasons the region might have struggled for a really long time is they specialized in a wine grape that is planted all over the world, and there's a tendency, at least in the United States, to think maybe Sancerre, maybe White Bordeaux, New Zealand, Sauvignon Blanc, those are typical styles, and anywhere else, Sauvignon Blanc just tastes like Sauvignon Blanc. But Styrian Sauvignon Blanc, I think, should almost be viewed as its own category, kind of
Right.
like White Bordeaux or Sancerre, because regardless of the producer, there is a feel to the wines. They're way more full-bodied than a lot of Sauvignon Blancs of the world. They're really, really powerful wines. They're certainly very crisp, but they're just a lot more massive than Sauvignon Blancs that I think most people are familiar with. And especially that increases with the single vineyards, the Grasnitzberg that Temet does that is one powerful wine.
And for all these you putting together wine list, one of the best things I ever did was start using my Sauvignon Blanc slot on the glass pour list for Sauvignon Blanc from this region, because it really pleases everyone. You know, it's got everything you need in it. So you're not, you know, you talked about having a grape that is very universally planted. People have their ideas made, their mind made up about what it's supposed to taste like. So you run the risk, just like with Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, of people being disappointed because it doesn't match theirs, even if it's a well-made wine. And I find that this one has pleased every set of expectations that people have about Sauvignon Blanc when they come in. I couldn't. It's like a silver bullet in that part of the wine list. And that's for the classic. Then you can really, like, once you get them hooked on that, then that's the gateway drug, and then you get them hooked on the like stuff like the Grasnitzberg and stuff like that.
So I think at this point we should move on to the final wine, which is the red. And this is one that I chose. One of my, without any exaggeration, just one of my favorite wines in all of France. This is the type of wine that I could drink any night of the week. I pour it by the glass at Michael Mina. I've poured it by the glass, I think, for the last 8 months. And before that, we worked with it at RN74. I just love the region of Bandol. Like I mentioned about Chateauneuf-du-Pape-Blanc, it's one of the few regions left in France that I think you could still have the best wines for a really, really affordable price. And maybe the top two most famous producers, the price has escalated significantly, but across the rest of the appellation, there's still these really traditional producers that have been making wine since the 70s. And I know this wine I buy for less than most entry-level Bourgogne Rouges, and this is one of the top wines made by the Domaine. So the Domaine is La Bastide Blanche. It's the Bronzo family who settled here, to my understanding, in the 70s. And this is one of their two single vineyards. They have a single vineyard called Fontenay, and this is the Estagnol. Fontenay is north-facing, and this is west-facing. East-facing, to my understanding. Yes. And they're both the exact same blend, 92% Mourvèdre, 8% Grenache. And they're just really, really powerful wines that are also very different from one another. I love tasting them both side by side. The Estagnol, I think, is a little bit more powerful than the Fontenay. It's made from slightly older vines, but the Fontenay is, because it's north-facing, it's a little bit more shaded from the sun. And I think you get a little bit more muscle in this wine. And it reminds me of one of my favorite wines in the world. If money was no object, I could drink an old vintage of Hommage à Jacques Perrin from Chateau Beaucastel and drink that for the rest of my life. And this is a wine that for, like under $35 retail, it just reminds me of that. Completely different expression and, different price point. But for an everyday wine to remind you of one of the greatest wines in the world, I think is really, really special. And this is just a perfect example of Mourvèdre's capability to age really, really well. I've had it as old as the early 90s, and it, I've never had a bottle of Bandol that was too old. Certainly not from Bastide Blanche. They're really, really dark. They're meaty. They have this like blood, iron quality to them. They remind me of when people describe Syrah as being this really meaty, muscular variety. This wine is like that times 10 because it's so much more about that muscle and that non-fruit quality than it is about any fruit. There is a little bit of like a blackberry prune quality, but it's so much more about that smoky earthiness, and it's just a really, really savory wine all around. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta say, what I love about Bendel can often be one of the issues to me, where you almost have to put it away for 10 years before you touch it, and that's true of a lot of producers. What I love about Bastille Blanche is it's something that you can drink now. You can put it on by the glass now. You don't have to wait for it to get 10, 15 years old to even start to soften a little bit. They've done a really great job of making them approachable without stripping them of their character.
Yeah, and it also, is very pleasing to people who like big wines of the New World, people who love big Napa cabs. I love pouring this wine for people who ask for Caymus at Michael Mina, and I'm not comparing this to Caymus at all. It's not at all in that style, but for people who love really full-bodied, massive red wines, I've been really successful in pouring people a taste of this, and they say, wow, that's not exactly what I was inquiring about with Caymus, but I love it. It's super, super different, and tell me about it more. So I just find that it has an ability to just appeal to a wide portion of the population that doesn't know about this region yet.
Well, I would say that your description of the Mourvedre grape and this vineyard and this wine in particular were just absolutely perfect. I mean, I couldn't have expressed it better. It's the vineyard. It's the best area or best parcel within their vineyards there at Saint-Anne-de-Castellet. The vines are about 50 years old. As you can see, the blend is about 92% Mourvedre, 8% Grenache, and that'll only vary a little bit depending on the year because it's a field blend. That's the blend that was planted. It is a big wine, no doubt about that. But it's aged entirely in one large foudre. Depends on the vintage, whether it would be 1,500 liter or 1,800 liter, depending on the yields. But it's not, there's no barrique. It's all in that one foudre. And even though it's a big wine, I think it always manages to have balance. And as you said, accessibility when it's young. It's a shame that it's so good when it's young because it really does repay aging. I just recently had a 1997, and yeah, as you said, Jeremy, no signs of age. They're remarkable and extraordinary value, and Bandol is the place in the world for Mourvedre, like the Côte de Nuit is for Pinot Noir. Bandol is it's just the perfect combination because the Mourvedre, it thrives. This is limestone soil, but it likes clay. This is a clay limestone. Wherever there's clay, it thrives. It needs to have very, very, very dry climate, but with a good supply of moisture underneath, a steady supply, and that's where the clay limestone is ideal, but especially right there in the Mediterranean. I've worked with the Bronzo family since the late 80s. I can't remember the first vintage. I think it was maybe 89. And every year, great consistency. Their rosé is a very important for us. It's about 71 or 72% Mourvedre every year. And they are masters of the Mourvedre grape.
Right on.
And to my understanding, they also make a really small amount of white from one of their single vineyards. I was wondering if you could speak to their white Bandol, which is something that people don't really think about Bandol as a white wine region. They think about it as a rosé, and the best rosés in the world. I think a lot of sommeliers would say those are from Bandol, and certainly the benchmark for Mourvedre, but people don't think about it as a white wine terroir.
Yeah, yeah. This is. I'm glad you mentioned that. Their parcel. The what we get is from a single parcel, also near Estagnol. Very, very old vines. It's Ugni Blanc and Claret. I believe it's just maybe a tiny bit more Claret than Ugni Blanc. But the vines are 75 years old now. All done in tank, no oak, but a wine that obviously is not made with Chardonnay, but there's a stylistic quality to it that is almost reminiscent of a Burgundy. There's such a balance and a minerality to it that's it's really remarkable, and it's a lot of fun. Surprise people with.
Cool. Well, I think we've timed this well, where we have about 6 or 7 minutes for some questions. So feel free to get them up if you want to put them into the comments. In the meantime, I just have a few that I wanted to kick out. I still find, even as we've gotten this far along, that people often still use the terms organic and biodynamic interchangeably, at least on our side, obviously not the winemakers, but I find they do. Could you give us just your quick rundown, Peter, on the differences between the two?
Well, organic basically addresses what the treatments are. You're limited to sulfur in spraying against the various maladies of the vine, with a very, very limited amount of copper can be used at certain times, and that blend of sulfur and copper is known as the Bouillet Bordelais. And then in the wine making, you're limited to certain amounts of sulfites, but it doesn't restrict, for instance, your ability to machine harvest. It doesn't say that you have to have indigenous yeasts. Doesn't say anything about filtering. So it's really an examination of what the treatments are. Biodynamic, on the other hand, is really, it goes into the entire organism of the vine and how the vine interacts in its environment, not just its earthly environment, but in relation to the movement of the planets, the moon particularly, and it all was started by a Swiss gentleman by the name of Rudolf Steiner back at the turn of the 20th century. And a fellow named Chauveau, I think his name, I can't remember his exact name, a Frenchman, sort of transplanted that or translated that. Chauvet, thank you, Chauvet. Translated it to the vine. It's much more rigorous, and it's very difficult.
We have one question from Andy, who represents Weygandt Wines in California. So maybe he asked this question because he thought it would be a good follow-up to the last one. But what was the reason that you went into wines of the Republic of Georgia? From my knowledge, we have the Terrassi Minazze Sulicuri at Michael Mina, but do you have other producers at the moment from Georgia, or is it just that one so far?
Yeah, we have 3 producers. There's the Minazze family. There's also a gentleman, George Volsky, and the name of the domain is Andrea Gavino. Gavino is the Georgian word for wine. And the third is Georgi or Gia Toganidze. Toganidze and Volsky are in Kakheti, and Minazze is in Imereti. Why did I go into the wines of Georgia? That's probably no more rational or reasonable answer than a lot of the things I do in my life. But I was attracted to it. I love these natural wines, and if they're done really well, and amber wines, if they're done really well. And I was, I guess, determined, is the word, to find really good examples of those. It's a beautiful country, magnificent people, wonderful people. As you know, the tradition of winemaking dates back 8,000 years. They've, carbon dated these very, earthen vessels that were 8,000 years old. So it's, as I found when I visited there, it's like every family has some relative or some ancestor in their family who's making wine. Wine is as much a part of the culture of Georgia as it is of France. It's a fascinating place.
So if you need someone to give with some street cred to tell you to go try wines in Georgia, I don't think it gets much better than Peter Weygandt, who I think's been ahead of so many trends. I think you probably were the first to really adopt producers who were biodynamic, and a lot of even these regions. I think we're one of the first to delve into them. When somebody's ahead of the trends that consistently, they're probably leading the trends and creating something.
I don't think you chase trends, but somehow
yeah.
a lot of the producers that you find become, some of the most in demand. These I think could one day be among those, but Richard Leroy and Tremblay and Jackie Truchot. There's just and Vuitton, there's such a long list of producers that you found, maybe not because you thought that they were going to be the next trendy wine, just because you followed your palate. And, by doing that, you ended up, introducing wines to the United States that then became super, super popular and in demand. And I think we have one question.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes remaining, so we might get cut off. It's from Colin. Hey, Colin, thanks for joining us. It's about, just wants to hear, Peter, your thoughts on producers you import, how you find them, maybe how, is there any producer you're itching to bring into the States?
Well, there's a lot of different ways I make the acquaintance of producers, but it doesn't take long, either speaking to them on the phone or meeting them, that you can that they are seeing what wine should be and how it should be made, and the relation between what comes out of the bottle and what goes in from the vineyards. It's all about the work. I just happen to be a lucky person to find the right people who do all the work, and I just get to put my name on the bottle.
Well, you do a good job.
Yeah, thanks for picking them out for so long and bringing some of these great wines to the country. We're finishing up, so is there anything you want to?
I just want to reiterate for anyone who didn't catch the first part of it that all of the wines we mentioned today are available via Flatiron Wines in San Francisco. So anyone who wants to find any of them, reach out to Flatiron Wines. And thank you for joining. This was super fun.
Yeah, great talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me. It was a pure pleasure.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, everyone, for watching.